So again, apartheid means apartness. Okay, and again, it is unique. The concept is not unique to South Africa, but apartheid is. So you've written apartness down here. So let's go ahead and take a look at the. Oops. Let's take a look at the first section here. We're going to hear about the Dutch and how the Dutch became involved in South Africa. The question I want you to be listening to in this first passage is, how did they use farms and plantations to manipulate South Africans? So they're going to talk and give a little bit of introduction about apartheid, and then they're going to start talking about the Dutch involvement, and we'll stop and discuss this after each section. So pay attention. Here we go.
Let's talk apartheid. Where did this come from, Chuck? I mean, it was instituted in 1948, but it was way older than that.
Yeah, racial suppression was going on sort of from the 17th century on in Africa,
right,
or at least in southern Africa. And it wasn't South Africa at the time, we should point out. We'll get to that, though.
Yeah.
But the Dutch came there in the 17th century just as a little stop-off station they wanted to set up on the spice route.
Yeah.
Dutch East India Company, they were like, we need a place to kick back a little bit and rest on this trip.
Right.
And so I was about to say, they said, do you mind? I don't think they asked.
No, they did not.
They just sort of set up shop there, and they were not there to colonize initially.
That was just to set up a way station.
Yep, just to set up a station. And but because they were Europeans, they did bring along with them the thought that white people are supreme to black people.
Right, and to prove it, they brought along black slaves with them.
That's right. So that notion is immediately set up like, hey, we're better than you.
Right.
You can't tell us what to do. We have guns, and we're more quote-unquote advanced if you follow along those European lines of what advanced is.
Right. And because they were Europeans during the Age of Exploration, they said, let's colonize anyway. Let's do it.
That's true.
So they did. And they started setting up settlements that weren't united, but were basically the Dutch, and then later on the British, and to a much lesser extent the French, basically saying, just undergoing a land grab that involved basically taking land from the indigenous people there and then setting up farms.
Sounds like another country.
Yeah, it sounds really familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, they basically would try and negotiate for land, and if that broke down, they were like, all right, we're taking it.
Right, and then they would take the land, turn the land into plantations, start growing stuff for export, and then the people would say, we're starving out here. And the Dutch people would say, well, come on in and work for us for like next to nothing. And at the very least, you'll live long enough to till our fields.
Yeah.
And that's how the whole thing began.
All right, so let's stop there. He said that's how the whole thing began. So what began? How do they use farms and plantations to manipulate South Africans? Well, let me back up before we answer that and just say that the Dutch were traders. They're the Dutch East India Company. Before the Suez Canal, which we discussed and learned about, a month ago, which is that, canal is always man-made between Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, which now cut off weeks of travel across to go from Europe to Asia. Prior to that Suez Canal, they had to travel from Europe all the way around the southern tip of Africa, which you know from our map this week is called the Cape of Good Hope down there at the bottom of South Africa. And they would have to round that and head over to Asia or on the way back. And so South Africa was kind of a natural, about halfway stop. And so they would stop off there. For want of a better term, they would stretch their legs and get some land under their feet and replenish water, whatever, or just, kind of a stop station for a little bit. And because they were Europeans, they had slaves at the time, and most of the slaves they had came from West Africa. And so in a very cruel and sadistic way, they brought these West Africans to South Africa and in a sense brought them back to their homeland of Africa, although separated by certainly, an entire continent, but still they brought them back to Africa as slaves, which is a slap in the face. But what they also did was they just kind of stayed there. They had no intention of colonizing, but they decided, let's just stay here and colonize anyway. So they did. And they began to look at the indigenous people, the Africans, as servants. And they also said, well, this land, we're going to take over this land and we're going to now farm the land. Well, the people who had been there for centuries were like, wait a minute, what in the world is going on? You're just taking over our stuff. And so the Dutch did so. They took over the farmland, and then the Africans were like, what about us? I said, oh, well, we'll let you farm it for us. and we'll let you keep a little tiny bit of the food. Now, the irony is that these people used to own these farms and own this land, and now they're begging to be able to work on the land that they once owned. It's a terrible thing. So that's the question, the answer to the first one. How do they use farms and plantations to manipulate South Africans? They force them to work on land that they once owned. That's demeaning. Think about it this way, and this is a dumb example, and it's not exact, but you get the idea. If you're sitting at your home one night, you're watching TV in your house, and your whole family's there, and maybe your extended family's there as well, and then all of a sudden some people that you've never seen before that look very different from you, that aren't even from here, come into your house and tell you, hey, we like this house a lot. It's on the corner, or it's got a nice backyard, or we like the way that the porch is, or whatever it is, and we're going to take over. And you're like, wait, this is our house. We've been here for a long time. Well, it doesn't matter. We're still going to take over. And you're like, well, where are we supposed to live? We'll tell you what, why don't you set up a tent in the backyard? We're still going to let you cook for us, and we're still going to have you clean the house, but we're going to need the deed to the house because we now claim it as our own. Now, that sounds ridiculous, right? I mean, that doesn't even make sense. But essentially, that's exactly what happened with the Dutch in South Africa. And they kind of joked about, they said, oh, it kind of sounds like another country too. Who are they referring to? Take a wild guess. Who are they talking about? America, the United States. Did we do the same thing to the Native Americans? They were here a long time. We came in, claimed the land, said it's ours, kicked them out. So yeah, this is not a new concept, sadly, but it is what happened in South Africa. And so the Dutch came in, took over, and then essentially forced the South Africans to work for them so that they could maintain the farms and the fields, and they reaped the benefits and the profits from that. Everybody clear on that? All right, so the British are going to get involved now. So let's see what they're going to do. A couple things to be mindful of. What discovery motivated the British to stay in Southern Africa? So something, you're going to hear about two things that were discovered that would probably make anybody stay. And then how did they use this to discriminate against the Africans? And then the next question is, what practice was thought to be the beginning of apartheid? So here we go.
Yeah, basically they would end up tilling the fields that they at one point owned themselves or used themselves as slaves.
Right.
And this was the Dutch at first until about the mid-1700s. Then British activity picked up in the region. And they, at the time it was, I think you said, just like various separate societies, farming, living agrarian lifestyle, ranching, hunter-gathering.
Right.
And then the Dutch and then the Brits came down there with their own slaves and took the land and said, you know what, we're going to battle with each other over this area. And eventually Britain gained control in the early 19th century from the Dutch even, but the Dutch were still there sort of running things. Is that how it worked?
Yeah, there were way more Dutch settlers than British, but the British had managed to gain control of it. And now it was a British colony.
And they said, but slavery is not legal.
No, but you can be you are a servant,
basically, yeah.
And we're going to codify this. And now, for the first time in this area, blacks were legally subservient to whites.
Yeah, so instead of master slave, it was master servant. Big diff.
And even though it was a British colony, it was still basically run and operated by the Dutch.
That's right.
And some Dutch didn't like that, so they pressed further and further inward, and ultimately creating more and more of an area for the future South Africa by dominating these tribes with guns, germs, steel, that whole thing.
Yep.
And then around about 1860, something really big happened. A little bit into the interior, they discovered diamonds and gold, and they said, "Oh, we're staying."
Yeah, and they said, we know you love farming and all that good stuff, but we think you'd be much happier working in a mine for next to nothing.
At the very least, it would make us happier if you were working in our mines.
That's right. And you know what? We're gonna brutalize you. We're gonna segregate you. We're gonna give you the most dangerous jobs.
Yeah.
And humiliate you and do cavity searches. And you know what? Now you have to have a passbook to go to your job as a miner, and you're going to be paid a lot less. And the passbooks, the reason we mention that is it soon became a staple that you couldn't go anywhere you weren't supposed to go without a passbook.
Right. It was
initially started as a work thing, though.
In the mines of South Africa, that's where apartheid was born. and a lot of the apartheid techniques. Like,
Okay, so let's hit the first question. What discovery motivated the British to stay? Yeah, Jake.
Gold.
Diamonds and gold. That's going to motivate a lot of people, right? You're at your house, your parents like, you know what? The roof in our house needs to be replaced. The floors are sagging, the kitchen's outdated. Let's move. And you come in with dirty hands and go, hey, look, mom and dad, I just found a gold and diamond mine in the backyard. Your parents would be like, we're keeping the house forever, right? So uh, the British discovered, well, I don't know who discovered it, but gold and diamonds were discovered in South Africa. The British laid claim to it and said, yeah, we're going to stick around, because they were on the fence if they wanted to get involved in South Africa or not. And this obviously motivated them to stay. So how did they use this to discriminate against the Africans? What did they force the Africans to do? Yeah, Jake. They forced them to go to the mines. Working in the mines was dangerous. It was dirty. It's demeaning. And so they forced the Africans to work in the mines. Of course, they didn't get to keep any of the spoils from the mines, right? They didn't get to keep any of the gold and the diamonds. That all went to the British. But they forced them to work in the mines, and then they took the profits. The British took the profits for themselves. Certainly not an equal partnership at all. So what practice was thought to be the beginning of apartheid? Does anybody remember what he mentioned? He mentioned it briefly. Yeah, Mason? The passbook. So write down passbooks. Now here's the deal. We're going to come back and talk about passbooks. In fact, there's a whole section on page 2 of this assignment that we're going to talk about passbooks. But let me just briefly introduce the concept. The concept of a passbook was the idea that you as a well, in South Africa, you were considered, if you were black, you were now considered not really a person. And so you had to carry around identification papers. Now imagine this, and again, I'm trying to bring an analogy to it. It's not the same thing, but you get the idea. Here at school, we ask you to carry around your ID badge, right? Mine's here, right? You carry around the ID badge. Why? So that you can scan out library books, so that you can pay for your lunch and stuff, right? We don't necessarily want you to always have it around your neck or whatever. I think that was a suggestion at first, and some of you still do. Some of you, if you don't buy your lunch and you don't check out library books, you might keep it at home or keep it somewhere. But most of you probably have it here. But I'm gonna guess some of you probably have your ID card at home, or you've lost it or something like that. But imagine if all of a sudden the school says you are required to constantly always have your ID badge on you, and one day you forget it at home, or your lanyard breaks or something like that, and you don't have it, right? And you're walking down the hallway with 3 other of your friends who all have their badges hanging around their neck, and yours isn't. And the teacher stops you and says, hey, where's your badge? Like, oh, I forgot it at home, or I lost it, or whatever the reason is. And they say, well, no, it's against the rules. And they grab you and they take you down to the office and they put you in school suspension for 2 weeks. Would you feel a little isolated, first of all, right? You wouldn't feel, you'd be separated, but also, would you feel a little discriminated against, maybe? Like, wait, I know I'm supposed to be here. I was with 3 of my friends who all had their ID cards. It's not like I snuck into, who's going to sneak into school, right? So I'm supposed to be here. And the teacher that took me down to the office is Mr. Lane. I have him as a teacher, right? But yet he didn't really even see me as a student. He just saw me as someone who broke the law. And now you're going to feel a little put out by it. You're going to feel, perhaps you're going to be mad, but you're also going to feel a little hurt. You're going to feel maybe even like less of a student here at Riverside, because you think you're not seen as one because you don't have your badge on. Well, take that to the gajillionth degree, and not about school and an ID badge, but about your own race and your own people and your own history and culture. And if you don't carry around this passbook with you, then you are considered less of a person. And so the idea of apartheid, which we already just explained what that means, this is the beginning of that, where they're beginning to, I'm going to use this completely incorrectly, but they're going to apart the culture. They're going to split the cultures up, and they're going to keep them apart. You have to have this ID passbook in order to be legal. The white Europeans, the British and the Dutch, don't have to have this, just the Africans. Does this make sense so far? Well, I'm sorry, that doesn't make sense. None of this stuff makes sense. But do you understand the passbooks were for? Yes or yes? Everybody online good? I can't see you, but object to me if you give me some thumbs up or something. Everybody good? I got one
Yeah.
thumb. I got one thumb. Yes. Okay, two thumbs. All right. Hopefully we're good. All right, let's keep going here. Let me get my glasses on so I can see what the next thing is. Let's talk now about um, Afrikaners. I did not misspell Africa. Okay, this is how you spell Afrikaner. It's with a K and two A's. It's a new culture group that comes about. So who were they? They'll explain that. And then what was the first restriction against the Africans? So not Afrikaans, the Africans under the new South Africa. And what was the second? So who were the Afrikaners and what restrictions did they put on the Africans? We're going to talk about two. Here we go.
Like you say, passbooks, and just the general degradation of blacks in South Africa area. It all began. I mean, it was already in place, but just the brutality of it, I take it really picked up in the mines.
Yeah, for sure.
So that was what, the 1860s.
Yeah.
And that was pretty much the way it was. It was a British colony in South Africa. It wasn't South Africa yet, but it was a British colony. The Dutch were ruling it. The blacks, they're the African, the indigenous natives, were on the losing end of all of this in a very brutal fashion. And then in the early 1900s, in I think 1908, the people who were running this British colony, the Dutch, said, "Hey, man, we want a little more authority here."
Yeah, and they were, at this point, they were Afrikaner. Like,
right.
In the past century, they had changed a lot. They had this weird hybrid language that developed, and they were Dutch in heritage, but they were starting to become a new people in Southern Africa, which is Afrikaner.
They probably felt about as Dutch as like you and I feel British.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, that's a good point.
But yeah, so yeah, they were like a whole new group. But the basis of this was that they were a whole new group who had grown up in charge of another group.
Yeah.
And they wanted to make sure that they had a free hand in dealing with these other subclasses. And also I want to say, like, anytime you hear me say subclasses, I'm making air quotes, everybody.
Yeah, and when I say big difference between master slave and master servant, I was being sarcastic.
Right.
We're anti-apartheid.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
So these Afrikaners running the show sent a new constitution to Britain, and Britain said, "Okay, go ahead. We're going to go ahead and grant this. It's going to be called the South Africa Act of 1910, and with that, British decreed that the state of South Africa was born.
That's
Still
right.
British colony, but it was officially under Afrikaner control.
That's right.
And one other thing, black people can't hold office ever.
Yeah, that's like the first of what would be many, many, many restrictions.
And that's a huge one because all of a sudden you have an all-white government made up of white people who feel that it is their white man's burden to keep you from being shiftless and lazy and thieving and just killing yourselves and cutting off your own hands and killing one another. It's up to the white man to make sure you don't do that. And we're going to keep you safe by subjugating you. And the first way we're going to do that is to just have an all-white government.
That's right. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to take your land because even though we only make up 20% of the population as white people, we need 93% of the land. So we're going to shuffle 80% of the people onto 7% of the land. Really crappy land.
Really bad land with really bad housing.
And that was under the leadership of General Louis Botha.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop it there. So again, who are the Afrikaners? It's a whole new group of people made up of Dutch descendants. They created a whole new language. It's based on partial Dutch, partial English, probably some African tribal, South African type things thrown in there as well. But it's a whole new cultural group. And they said it's a generation who grew up in control of another group of people. And so it was built into their culture that they are better, that they are controlling these Africans. Okay. Not, in my opinion, a good thing to have on and your heritage. What was the first restriction that they enacted against the Africans? What was the first thing they did, Mason?
They couldn't hold office.
Yeah, no black South African could hold an office. Now, again, this is South Africa. 80% of the population were black, and now no longer can they hold office. And again, by means of saying we are in control. What was the second restriction? Did you guys catch that one? They took their land and they said, we're going to live on the best land. Again, 20% of the population was white. They took 93% of the land, the good land, the beachfront property, the good farmland. They left the 7% of the not so good land to 80% of the people. Now, what happens when you put a whole bunch of people in a small area? What's going to happen? Mason? Disease, because if one person gets it, they're going to spread it, right? Why do you think that right now I only have 16 deaths in here instead of 30 and half of you are at home? Ramsey? Absolutely, because we are trying to prevent the coronavirus from spreading. We have less people in the classroom, we're spread out, and we're wearing masks. And so far, it's slowly making a difference, right? I mean, it's been a year, but we're finally getting it right, and we're keeping distance, and we've got masks and all that, and it's slowing down just a bit. And so imagine though, if we didn't do that, and we had all 30 people in here at once, and it's not crowded here, but you're not like living in luxury either, right? Imagine twice as many desks in here, which is what it normally is. It's not terribly crowded, but it certainly doesn't like we have now. But then imagine, let's say we put 90 people in here. Well, it's like literally like you're shoulder to shoulder. You don't have much room to do anything. And so you're going to pass on sickness. And in addition, in a real world situation in life, the more people there are in an area, the fewer jobs will be available for those people, because there's only so many jobs you can have. And that means if there's 30 people to do 30 jobs, well, that's a pretty good thing. But if there's 90 people to do 30 jobs, well, that means 60 people aren't going to have a job, which leads to poverty. And that leads to crime. And that leads to whatever. It leads to a lot of stuff. And so South Africa, for a long time, was in a bad way because a majority of their population was living in a really small, condensed area, and it was not good. And whereas the rest of the white South Africans are like, ooh, look at all this room we got, okay? So those are the first two restrictions. They said they can't hold office, and we're going to start taking your land. We're going to segregate you by what you look like on the land. Now, the next thing, the Bantus. Last week, I mentioned, well, we did a whole lesson on the Bantu migrations. And I told you to remember that name because it's going to pop up again in South Africa. Well, here it is. Remember, the Bantu migrations was the 2,000-year process of moving Africans, the migration of Africans from West Africa through Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa eventually. The Bantu people is kind of an umbrella of people. And there were hundreds of different offshoots within the Bantu umbrella, but no one really called themselves eventually Bantu. It's just an ancient thing. Well, I believe, this is my opinion, so it's just an opinion. I believe the Dutch, the Afrikaners, brought back the term Bantu as a way of just of almost a derogatory name to remind the South Africans, you are Bantu, you're not really Africans, you're not really people, you're not really this, we're creating a whole new thing for you, and we're going to call you Bantu. So who were the Bantu? What officially created the Bantu? And then what three social classes were created from this? So it's going to go back quick, so pay attention, and they're going to talk about these.
First Prime Minister of South Africa, and the Native Lands Act of 1913 basically was when they said, you know what, we're going to move all these communities. If we kill you along the way or you die, no big deal. If your whole life is disrupted, no big deal. And we're essentially going to shove you onto these tiny parcels of crappy land.
Yeah.
So that began what's called the segregation period.
Right.
You can't go here. This is white land.
Right. and during the segregation period between the 1913 Lands Act and the 50s or 1948, a bunch of other things happened for the blacks who came to be called Bantus, the indigenous Africans. They lost the right to vote in the 30s.
Yep.
In the 20s, they had lost the right to unionize.
Yeah.
And basically, they were just being pushed further and further out of a meaningful participation in society.
Yeah, they tried to hamper their access to education even early on, and fired them from jobs even if they were totally more skilled than a white worker.
Yeah, if you were a skilled craftsman and you had apprenticed, you couldn't carry out your craft any longer.
No.
But legally, they could go in and be like, you know what? There's a white guy who we think is better for this job, so you're fired.
Yeah, because that was the government.
Right. And this was even before the Afrikaner Nationalist Party. This is before apartheid officially.
Yeah, that didn't come around until 1948.
1948, when, again, with an all-white government that had been in power for 35 years, this extreme right-wing, basically a fringe movement, the Afrikaner Nationalist movement, came to power, and they officially instituted what we call apartheid. Their apartheid policies, starting in 1948, but really kicking off in 1950 with the Population Registration Act, right?
Yeah, and this was under Prime Minister D.F. Mullen at the time. And with the Population Registration Act is when they created officially the Bantu, like you said, and named the indigenous black population. There's Bantu, there's white, and then there's colored, which is mixed race.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to register yourself and be legally classified as one of these three races.
Okay, so the Bantus, who were they? They're the indigenous South Africans, right? Which, again, my opinion, the term Bantus was brought back out to kind of say, remind them that you're not really full people. Instead of calling them South Africans, it's remember you're just immigrants from someplace else. What officially created the Bantu, it's called the Population Registration Act, that officially created Bantu as a race of people, a class of people in South Africa, the Population Registration Act. I don't normally ask you to remember like official policies, but this one's important. The Population Registration Act. What three social classes were created? What do you remember what they said? What were they? Yeah, Jake. Bantu, white and colored. Blacks, white and colored, right? The Bantu, as South African blacks, there was the colored and there was the whites. Well, the whites, we know are the Afrikaners, or people of European descent. We know that the blacks are the Bantu, indigenous Africans. Well, what's this colored? Because the British Empire was so large, they had a lot of different colonies around the world, including the country of India. There were a lot of Indians living in South Africa at the time because it was the same British Empire. And a lot of Indians came to work in the mines, the salt mines, the gold mines, and so forth, because it was good work and they could get a good wage, or at least a wage. And so a lot of Indians living in South Africa. Well, as happens, an Indian person might have fallen in love with a South African Bantu. They get married and they have children. Those children then would not be seen as neither black nor Indian. They would be seen as what? What's the second class of people? Colored, right? Anybody who was not white and not black was considered colored. Now, Indians kind of had their own separate thing. They'll explain that in a minute. But anybody else was kind of seen as colored, this race. Yeah, question. Yeah. All right. So does this all make sense? Well, again, none of this makes sense, but are we clear? Yeah, Ramsey? Which one? Who were they? The indigenous South Africans? Indigenous, yeah. Okay, so now on either the back side or the second page of this, we're going to come back to the idea of passbooks. And so they're going to talk more about passbooks, and they're going to mention a guy named Gandhi. If you've ever heard the name Gandhi, you probably have heard him referred to in India. Gandhi was Indian. And because, again, India is part of the British Empire, just as South Africa is, people could travel back and forth. When Gandhi was a young man, he was an attorney. And he was hired in South Africa to represent a company. And so he traveled to South Africa to hold a trial. as an attorney. While he was there, something happened that caused him to get in trouble. It was not his fault. He was thrown in, well, he protested and was thrown in jail, in prison for a long time. What was supposed to be probably just a few week trial, he lasted in South Africa for 20 years. And he was in prison for a chunk of that time, not the whole time, but he was in prison for part of that time. But he got his political activism started in South Africa. And then in the early 20th century, about 1914, 1915, he went back to India and then proceeded to try to gain independence from India, I'm sorry, for India from Great Britain. But he got his start in South Africa. You do not need to write anything down for Gandhi's page here section. We're going to talk about India and Gandhi in a couple of weeks, but just know he got his start in South Africa. If it were not for apartheid, there might not be a Gandhi that we would know of. And if that's the case, there might not be a free, independent India that we know of today. It might still be part of the British Empire, and certainly their history would be different without Gandhi taking up his cause. But we're going to talk about past books, and we're going to do this. Here we go.
Everyone was.
Everybody. If you're white, good news for you.
Yeah, because you got 93% of the land.
Yeah, if you're Bantu or mixed race, then bad luck for you.
Right, and then at first Indians were left out, and Indians, I guess, because it was a British colony.
Yeah.
Since India was also a British colony, South Africa was kind of a place to be for Indians, including Gandhi, who was one of the early protesters of this segregationist idea, and was imprisoned for, I think, 20 years in South Africa.
Yeah, he was.
Or he was imprisoned while he was there for 20 years. He spent part of it in prison for protesting segregation.
Peacefully, of course.
But then, ultimately, Indians were excluded as foreigners, but then just to keep problems from happening, or just to keep the bureaucracy going,
right,
they were added as a fourth race.
That's right. You could not get married between races. If you were Bantu and loved with someone of mixed race, you couldn't even marry them. It's very restrictive. And then next came another act called the Group Areas Act, and this really escalated the segregation because now you needed passbooks, essentially passports, to go from one area to another. Some you weren't even allowed in, and that even went further in the Bantu Homelands Act of 1951, which basically said, you know what, wherever your area is in South Africa, that is now your homeland, and you're not even South African anymore.
Yeah, if you're Bantu, you live in this area. If you're a Bantu married to a colored person, your colored spouse lives in a different area.
Yeah.
Your family's just ripped apart now.
Well, they took away, basically, they said, you're not even South African.
Right.
We're allowing you to stay here, basically, if you stay in this one area that your passbook says that you can stay in.
Right, because you can't stay here because you're no longer a member of this country.
Unbelievable. Like, I drew exclamation points next to that one just because, like, they literally moved in, took over these people, and then said, you're not even a part of this country that we've established.
So they've been pushed out of participation in society. Anybody who is not white is now forced onto a reservation.
Yeah, essentially.
And then they really kind of started indoctrinating the next generation with the Bantu Education Act of 1953. And basically, if you were Bantu, you would be put into a school where the student-teacher ratio was about 56-1 on average. You went to school 3 hours a day.
Yeah.
They did it in 2 shifts. A teacher would see 2 different classes, 3 hours for one, 3 hours for another. And you would be taught basically how, like, the history of your people was that you were kind of dumb and meandering, and you hadn't really done anything with the land before, and how you were reliant on the white people who came to rescue you and your people.
Yeah.
You were taught how you could work in a factory, and that's about as good as it got for you.
Yeah.
And basically, they were taught to be servile and better servants to the white Afrikaners.
Yeah. Well, that was the plan.
Okay, so I'm going to stop here real quick. I want to talk in the bells. I know we're almost close on time, but let's talk about the Bantu schools. How are they taught? They were taught in crowded classrooms, and they were taught 3 hours at a time. And what were they taught? They were taught that they were no good. They were taught they were servants. They were taught that they had an opportunity to run their land, but they screwed it up. And it took the white Europeans to come in and save them. And they were indoctrinated. And they taught this to these kids. Now, one thing that I can promise you, I'm a proud public school teacher. We certainly have our issues and our problems, and there's a whole lot of wrong with the public education system, but there's a whole lot of right too. And I think one thing that I know I've tried to do in my 25 years is to encourage my students that you can do whatever you want to do. And I, in my 24 years previous, I've seen students, well, ones that are old enough to get jobs, I've taught doctors and lawyers and teachers and stay-at-home moms and dads and auto mechanics and CPAs. And there's a guy, one of my former students, he works out for Yelp out in San Francisco. There's, you could be anything you want to be, and that's what we teach you. And I hope you've heard that a million times. I hope you've heard it so much you forget that you've heard it, because we tell you you can be whatever you want to be. And I hope you've heard the same thing from your parents. But imagine being told in your schools that you're not any good. The only thing you're good at is for working in a factory pushing a button, or working on a farm pushing a plow, because that's all you can do, because you're never going to be better than that. In fact, you're not even smart enough to do anything. It takes someone else who's a different skin color than you to come in and do a better job than you are. This is what was taught to these people, and it was what taught to their parents. And so their parents weren't giving them a different message at home, or if they were, there wasn't anything they could do about it anyway. And so that's how they were taught. Now, here's what I want you to do. The last question: how do you think this affected your outlook on life? I want you to, in the remaining couple minutes of class, I want you to answer that in your own words. Answer that. How do you think this affected your outlook on life? And then I want you to submit this. The last three things on Stephen Biko, Nelson Mandela, and divestments. We're going to finish this up next week as we wrap up Africa. I will finish this story, but I want you to turn this in now so it's off your plate. We've done most of the heavy lifting on this topic, and then we'll wrap it up. It does end. Apartheid does end in the 80s. That's the good news. There's certainly feeling residuals from that even today, but it is better. And I'll finish this story next week. But I want to give you the opportunity to finish this up, since we did it in class together. If you turn it in now, whether you're at home or here in class, then it's off your plate and you don't have to worry about doing it later. Okay. With that, the first bell just rang here. So what I want you guys to do is finish this up and then submit it. If you're at home, I'm gonna let you go, and I will see you guys later on this week. Well, I guess I won't see you. I'll see you on next week, but make sure you check in on Friday for the quiz.